Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I am your host, Rajni Gamage, a Postdoctoral Fellow at the Institute. Joining us today is Dr Tilak Abeysinghe, Adjunct Senior Fellow at ISAS NUS, to help us understand Sri Lanka's economic and political situation. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Abeysinghe.
Yep.
Sri Lanka faced an unprecedented economic crisis last year, which culminated in the country declaring bankruptcy and manifesting in long power cuts and fuel shortages. This resulted in mass protests and the sitting president at the time being ousted from power. So could you tell our listeners, Dr. Abeysinghe, what the current situation in Sri Lanka is?
The current situation in Sri Lanka is a lot better than what it used to be. Chaotic situation has settled down quite a bit, but it takes a while for the country to get out of the woods. Now, to make the matters worse, the country is currently facing a severe drought condition. Rice-growing districts, today's news just showed me 5 districts, very badly affected. Main reservoirs are drying up. Even the animals in facing problems of getting water. So if rice cultivation falls and rice need to be imported, so the country is already in a severe shortage of foreign exchange, so that things are going to get pretty bad. Assuming the rain will come back and the rice production stays on, the government is trying hard to meet the IMF conditionalities. In this regard, bringing the macroeconomic stability is the biggest challenge the government is facing. It is an uphill task for the government. Now, for macroeconomic stability, there are 2 things. One is the government budget balance. The other is the international trade balance. So both of these are well known as twin deficits. Containing the twin deficit is a severe challenge the government is facing. Now, regarding the government budget balance, the government has to increase government taxes and cut down government expenditure. There are many steps taken in this regard, but tax increases are met with severe protests. That's not very popular. Now, regarding taxes, one big problem the government is facing is that the country's tax base is the private sector is very small. If I compare with Singapore, in Singapore, corporate tax revenue as a share of total government revenue is very large. It used to be the largest, and now investment returns from reserves is the largest component, but still corporate tax revenue is the second largest. In Sri Lanka, this is very small. There are 2 reasons for this. One is our tax base, the private sector, is small. The second is the tax evasion. Now, even some government ministers, even the central bank reports talk about tax evasion problem, but nothing is done in this regard. Tax evasion is by business people. Wage earners cannot hide their income, so they usually get captured in tax net. Of course, apart from taxes, there are some other things that the government can do to increase government revenue, but unfortunately, the government is reluctant to touch on these because the elections are coming and popularity is a problem. I'll give you just one example. I have written on this earlier. That's the Sri Lanka's healthcare system is free healthcare system. Now, if the government imposes a small fee on patients, maybe 50 rupees, just multiply by the total volume of patients. It's a huge collection. Now, today, the situation is such that patients going to public hospitals, sometimes they have to bring their own bandages. Now, a small user fee on patient is going to be very unpopular. But the thing is that the same patient going to a private clinic pays 500 rupees, maybe 1,000 rupees for the private clinic. In the government hospitals, they are not ready to pay that. So this is a small example of other revenue sources that the government can touch on. Of course, following Singapore example, the hospitals have fee-paying wards. In Sri Lanka, fee-paying wards in public hospitals, one solution that can adopt. Now, that is to divert some private expenditure to the government sector, diverting private expenditure to the government sector. Now, in the case of Sri Lanka, people know, in general, people think that professional care in public hospitals is better than in the private hospitals, but rich people go to private hospitals because of the other amenities, infrastructure, facilities, and all that, not because of professional care. So quite often it is the same doctors who are in public practice go to the private sector for extra income. So fee-paying wards in public hospitals, also government pharmacies in public hospitals. These things can divert some of the private the expenditure that is going to the private sector to the government sector. Like this, there are other ways to increase government revenue. Unfortunately, because of the election fear, the government is not touching on this. But if Sri Lankan government is going to miss this opportunity to introduce bitter pills, introduce unpopular but very much needed policies, I'm a bit pessimistic about the country taking off.
Thank you, Dr. Abeysinghe. I think you articulated very clearly some of the critical impacts on key social sectors, such as the health sector. And you also mentioned a degree of protest and opposition by certain sections of the people against the reforms that the government is implementing. How do you see or observe the government responding to these protests or trying to manage this opposition?
Educating the public on this is not happening the way we expected. Now, the protests, mostly political protests, unfortunately, is fishing in the troubled waters. So some political parties are interested in coming to power. So some of these political protests is just purely, trying to fishing in troubled waters, basically, not to get the country out of the woods. But of course, the government is letting them go on. But the one thing I'm not very clear about the government policies, I don't see any plan going on. Most of the measures the government takes sort of on an ad hoc basis. So given the crisis situation, I think the government should have put out a plan. So these are the things that we are going to do. So educate the public. And on certain things, what we economists call moral suasion is needed. Tell the people we have to do this because there is no other way out. So like this, the government I don't think there is any plan as of now. There's no any plan. Most of the things are done pretty much on an ad hoc basis.
Thank you, Dr. Abeysinghe. As we are aware, a couple of weeks before, the President of Sri Lanka, Ranil Wickremesinghe, visited India on his first official visit since coming into power last year. How do you understand the President's visit to India against the context of the ongoing crisis? And what potential and challenges do you see in this bilateral engagement? I ask this question in the context of a growing perception that Sri Lanka is now moving closer to the Quad countries at the expense of its relationship with China.
Well, Sri Lanka's relationship with India has been quite cordial for a long, long time. Actually, Sri Lankans in general have a lot of respect for India because of the Buddhism. So I don't think this cordial relationship is not going to change. Now, we have to understand, I think Sri Lankan politicians understand the importance of geopolitics. Geopolitics plays a very, very important role. So Sri Lankan politician, no matter who is in power, is not going to jeopardize the relationship with India, by getting closer to, let's say, China or the US, not at the expense of India. I mean, again, I can bring Singapore example. Singapore is a US ally basically, but the importance of Indonesia and Malaysia, this is extremely important. So geopolitics is part of, as Goh Keng Swee in Singapore said, non-economic factors matter more than economic factors in economic growth. So one of them is actually geopolitics. So it's the right thing for the president to engage with India. Sri Lanka has to stay, as a close ally of India, but that doesn't mean that Sri Lanka has to distance from China or, for that matter, other countries. So this is basically anywhere in the world is the geopolitics happening in place. So in relationship with India has been helping Sri Lanka a lot. Going forward, I can see that the relationships are going to improve, but this is not going to be at the expense of other relationships.
Thank you, Dr. Abeysinghe. Sri Lanka's economic situation is not unique to the country. As we know, several other countries, especially lower income countries, but other countries in South Asia are facing conditions of financial distress. Do you think that the crisis in Sri Lanka has important lessons for other South Asian countries? And what impact do you think Sri Lanka's current situation might have on regional stability?
Of course, Sri Lanka is a good example for many others to learn from. Now, Sri Lanka was in the 1960s and 1970s was sort of hailed as an icon of high human development for a very low income country. All this happened as a result of welfare program. Unfortunately, although the welfare programs expanded, economic growth did not happen. So that led to build up of public debt. So a lot of people talk about this. Country living beyond its means was the problem. Actually, when you look at situation now, actually I have done a study on the debt situation, and I titled the paper as Debt Begets Debt. Currently, the problem is to pay off the debt, the government has to borrow. So it's not actually living beyond means. If you look at the social service programs in Sri Lanka, the quality has deteriorated quite a lot. So therefore, the big lesson the other countries have to learn is it's nice to have welfare programs, but economic growth has to be going. So in the case of Sri Lanka kept the private sector on the driver's seat and keep the country open for foreign investment. This problem could have been avoided, but unfortunately it did not happen. So these things should have gone hand in hand, welfare programs, and at the same time economic growth. So this is the lesson that other countries have to learn.
Thank you, Dr. Abeysinghe. President Ranil Wickremesinghe also visited Singapore and Japan last year. What scope for engagement and opportunities, especially on the economic front, do you think are present in bilateral engagement with these countries and the region?
Yes, Japan has been a close ally of Sri Lanka for a long time. Actually, Japan is one country that did not discriminate Sri Lanka, regardless of whether Sri Lanka is aligned with which country Sri Lanka is aligned with. So those relationships are going to continue. And in the case of Singapore, relationship with Singapore, economic relationships still yet to grow, still not sufficient. All those, Singapore, recall that, Sri Lanka signed a free trade agreement with Singapore when Ranil, current president, was the prime minister between 2015 and 2019. But unfortunately, that free trade agreement got, shelved, and I'm not too sure what's happening. But I did a study quite some time back, Singapore's investment in Sri Lanka. And most of this investment has happened in the service sector, mostly in service sector. Singapore needs to invest in other countries. Singapore's for indirect investment. Sri Lanka needs investment. So the manufacturing sector in Sri Lanka is very widely open for investment. When I looked at the data, I did this study some time back. One thing I noticed is that even in this relationship in Singapore and Sri Lanka, which may be true for other countries as well, Sri Lanka is still on the losing end, because most of the stuff is, let's say, Singapore's investment in Sri Lanka. To keep this investment going, productions going, a lot of things have to be imported. As a result, trade balance between these companies and between Sri Lanka and Singapore in relation to these investments has been negative for Sri Lanka. So there's a lot to be done. This relationship has to be improved. Economic ties have to be improved, but the policymakers also have to look into the matters like how these bilateral relationships, whether they are improving the trade balances.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Abeysinghe. In closing, I would like to ask you what going forwards, what are some of the major developments that we can anticipate in Sri Lanka's case? We know that elections coming up next year, most likely, the very serious drought conditions that you described to us, and then we have a government that is trying to implement very painful economic reforms in the context of a situation where the people are really struggling with economic hardships. What do you foresee?
Yeah, so basically, going ahead, the biggest one thing in the minds of the politicians is the elections. Now, for citizens like us, what we need is to get the economy going and get the people out of the poverty, at least people need to secure the basic living standards. My take on all this: it doesn't matter who comes to power, they have to keep the private sector in the driver's seat. Keep the private sector on the driver's seat and keep the country open to foreign investment. Sometimes people talk about, things like good governance. Good governance is actually a result of, private sector driven open economy basically creates its own checks and balances on government. Policymakers get disciplined as a result. They cannot act dictatorially if the private sector is in the driving seat. So whoever is coming into power in Sri Lanka has to keep it in mind. Instead of curtailing the private sector driven open economy, they have to keep it as the pillar of the economy.
Thank you, Dr. Abeysinghe, for sharing your insights. You are listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates through social media. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening.